The ship did not descend dramatically from the clouds. There were no columns of fire, no electromagnetic pulse that killed every circuit on the eastern seaboard, no transmission in mathematically perfect prime sequences. It simply appeared in low orbit on a Tuesday morning, a Tuesday in November, which somehow made it worse, and held position over the North Atlantic at an altitude of roughly 340 kilometers, broadcasting a looping signal on a frequency so ordinary that it was initially mistaken for a GPS calibration artifact. Dr. Yusuf Adeyemi Okafor was the third person to hear it clearly. He was a radio astronomer at the Jodrell Bank Center for Astrophysics in Cheshire, and he had been awake for 19 hours chasing what he believed was an anomalous pulsar. When the signal resolved itself out of the noise floor at 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time, he sat very still for 4 minutes, then called his department head, who called the Royal Greenwich Observatory, who called ANUSA in Vienna, who, through a chain of increasingly panicked escalations that took just over 11 hours, eventually notified the United Nations Secretary-General. The ship waited with extraordinary patience. Yusuf later told journalists, somewhat awkwardly, that his first thought was not fear or awe. It was that the signal structure was inefficient. Whoever had built it had used a redundant encoding scheme that wasted roughly 30% of its bandwidth on error correction. Like they were writing a letter to someone they weren't sure could read, he said. He meant it as a technical observation. It became the most quoted line of the decade. The signal contained coordinates. Not a landing site, a meeting point. 52 degrees north, 21 degrees west. The middle of the ocean. Depth, the surface. Time. 72 hours from the moment the signal had first been received. Which, accounting for the 11 hours of institutional delay, left humanity approximately 61 hours to decide who would attend its own first contact. The Security Council spent 40 of those hours arguing about jurisdiction. The remaining 21 were spent arguing about whether to bring weapons. They brought weapons. They also brought 3 linguists, 2 xenobiologists who had spent their careers speculating about life that might not exist, a physicist, a medical doctor, and, in a decision that would later generate considerable academic literature, Dr. Kezia Marketti-Obi, a cultural anthropologist who had written her doctoral thesis on the sociological function of ritual gift exchange in early Pacific Islander trade networks. No one was quite sure why she had been included. She suspected it was because she owned a blazer that fit. The vessel that descended to meet them was small. Considerably smaller than the orbital platform still holding position above, which satellite imagery had resolved into something approximately the size of a mid-sized cargo freighter. The descent vehicle was closer to the dimensions of a large recreational boat, matte black, with no visible seams, no engine exhaust, and no sound whatsoever as it came to rest on the ocean surface with the precision of a machine that had done this 10,000 times before. One figure emerged. She, and Kezia would later spend considerable effort explaining why she defaulted to that pronoun, was roughly 1.7 meters tall. Bilaterally symmetrical. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head at the top of a recognizable torso. She wore what appeared to be a suit of soft gray material that covered her entirely except for her face, which was humanoid enough to be readable and alien enough to be arresting. Her eyes were set slightly wider than a human's, her pupils vertical, her skin a grayish amber that seemed to shift slightly with the light, and she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had rehearsed every gesture. She stopped 3 meters from the human delegation. She looked at them. Then she reached into a pocket of her suit, a pocket, Kezia noted, that was positioned exactly where a human's pocket would be, and produced a small rectangular device, which she held up so they could see the screen. On it was displayed a single word, rendered in 47 human languages simultaneously, scrolling slowly enough to be read. Hello. General Peter van der Berg, commanding the security detail, had been instructed to stand down unless fired upon. He stood down. Later he said it was the pocket that got him. You don't put a pocket where a pocket is, he told the debrief, unless you've spent a very long time watching people. Her name, rendered into something approximating human phonemes, was Thessaly Ven Karath, third daughter of the Karath lineage, attached observer for the Valorian Exploratory Commission. Her title had no direct human equivalent. Observer was the closest the translation matrix could manage, but the Valorian concept embedded in the word implied something richer. A witness with the authority to testify. Someone sent not merely to watch, but to remember accurately and to speak on behalf of what she had seen. She spoke first in her own language, a layered tonal system that the linguist would spend years unraveling, while simultaneously playing a translation through the device she carried. Her first official statement to humanity, as recorded in the UN First Contact Archive and later mounted on a plaque in the lobby of the building that would become the Interspecies Diplomatic Center in Geneva, was this. We have been watching your broadcast for 61 of your years. We chose to make contact now because your communications suggest you are approaching a period of significant internal crisis, and we have found, in our experience with other civilizations, that species in crisis either grow or collapse. We would prefer that you grow. We are here to observe which you will choose. We do not intend to interfere. We are aware that this statement is itself a form of interference. Kezia Marchetti-Obi, standing at the back of the delegation in her blazer, thought, she's done this before. Not this species, not this ocean, but this moment. She knows exactly what she's walking into. And then she thought she came alone. That, Kezia would later argue in her first published paper on the encounter, was the most significant diplomatic signal of the entire exchange. Not the technology. Not the translation matrix. Not the 61 years of covert observation. The fact that whoever had sent Thessaly Van Karath to meet an armed delegation of frightened, historically violent primates on the surface of a cold ocean had sent her alone, that spoke to either extraordinary arrogance, extraordinary trust, or a calculation about human nature so precise it was almost insulting. Probably, Kezia concluded, all three. The Interspecies Diplomatic Center occupied a converted hotel on the outskirts of Geneva, chosen because it had a large parking structure that could be modified to accommodate the Valorian shuttle, a kitchen capable of being partitioned for different atmospheric requirements, and, crucially, a swimming pool which Thessaly Van had noted with evident interest when shown the floor plans. No one asked her why. They were still in the phase of not asking things that might seem rude. She moved in on a Thursday. She requested no special accommodations beyond a room with north-facing windows and permission to modify the air pressure in her sleeping quarters by approximately 4%. She asked somewhat formally what the process was for disposing of organic waste. She inquired whether the facility had a library. When told it had access to the internet, she went quiet for a moment in the way Kezia was beginning to recognize as processing, then said simply, "That will do." The coffee happened on day 9. Kezia had developed the habit of arriving early to the morning briefings, partly because she was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 6 and partly because the early hours were when Thessaly Van was most candid. The alien, the word felt reductive but the alternatives felt presumptuous, was methodical to a degree that bordered on mechanical during formal sessions, choosing every word with the deliberateness of a chess player. But before the other diplomats arrived, while the coffee was brewing and the morning light was coming flat and gray through the north-facing windows she had requested, she would sometimes simply sit and watch Kezia work, and occasionally ask questions. On day 9 she asked what Kezia was drinking. Coffee. It's a stimulant. Derived from roasted seeds. Most of us need it to function in the morning, though we tell ourselves it's a choice. Thessaly Van considered this. The stimulant is necessary or the ritual is necessary? Kezia paused. Both probably. The ritual more than we admit. May I try it? There had been extensive biochemical testing by that point. The Valorian physiological profile had been shared openly, another gesture that had caused considerable discussion among the security analysts, and Thessaly Van's metabolic system could process caffeine without significant risk, though her absorption rate was approximately 3 times a human's, which the medical team had gently suggested might be relevant information. She held the cup the way a person holds something they have seen others hold but never held themselves. Correctly but with a fraction too much attention paid to the grip. She drank. She put the cup down. She said nothing for approximately 40 seconds. "It's unpleasant," she said finally. "And I would like another cup." She understood us before she understood coffee. She understood coffee within a week. I'm not sure which observation disturbs me more. Dr. Kezia Marchetti-Obi, Private Notes, Month 2. The first 8 months were a careful, exhausting exercise in mutual calibration. The formal sessions produced the First Contact Accords, a document of 340 pages that established the terms of Valorian observation, set parameters for information exchange, and created a framework for what the UN diplomatically called graduated disclosure, meaning that humanity was given information about the broader interstellar community in carefully sequenced tranches. The theory being that if you tell a species everything at once, some percentage of them have violent breakdowns. The Valorians had done this before. They had a protocol. The informal sessions were where Kezia spent most of her energy, and where she learned the most. Thessaly Van was, by the standards of her own civilization, young. This was not immediately apparent from her bearing. She carried herself with the stillness of someone accustomed to patience. But it emerged over time in small ways. She had been to 4 previous first contact assignments, which within the Valorian Commission was considered relatively limited experience. She had opinions about those assignments, opinions she expressed with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed the careful distinction between observation and judgment many times and was not entirely convinced by it. She found human children bewildering and fascinating in equal measure. When Kezia's niece visited the center during a school trip and announced to Thessaly Venn that she had decided aliens were her new favorite thing, Thessaly Venn had spent the next 3 days asking Kezia increasingly detailed questions about how children formed categorical preferences and why a species with such precarious cognitive development in its juvenile stage had managed to produce functional civilizations. "Your children do not know very much," she said one morning over coffee. She now drank it black without comment as though she had always done so, and they are also not afraid of not knowing. The adults are the opposite. They know a great deal and are very afraid of the gaps. She paused. Your children are more interesting diplomatic interlocutors. They ask better questions. What do they ask? Whether I dream. Whether my planet has oceans. Whether I have a mother. She set down the cup. Whether I get lonely. Kezia waited. Thessaly Venn did not answer the implicit question. It was around month 4 that the security analysts, who had never stopped being security analysts regardless of what they had been told to put on their lanyards, delivered their assessment to the Secretary General. The assessment was classified and Kezia was not supposed to have seen it, but a copy found its way to her in the way that classified assessments tend to find their way to the people best equipped to understand them. It said essentially, she's too interested. An observer should observe. This one is engaging. She's learning us faster than we're learning her. She knows things about human social dynamics that she could only know if she's been studying the record extensively, far beyond the briefing materials she's been given. She uses idioms correctly, including new ones. She knows regional slang. She knows the names of the people who make the coffee. She knows which diplomat has a difficult marriage and adjusts her language accordingly. This is not the behavior of someone here to watch neutrally. Kezia read the report twice, then wrote a response she was also not supposed to write. It said, "Yes, you're right. And if that frightens you, I'd ask you to consider what it means that she is choosing to let you see it." She sent it anyway. Nobody responded. But the report was quietly shelved, and the security detail was reduced from 12 to 4, which was close enough to an answer. Month 11 began with a piece of news that most of the world's population did not receive until 2 days after it became relevant, because the communication structure surrounding the center had been quietly upgraded to allow for a 48-hour review of outgoing information. A clause in the accords that Kezia had always considered ethically fraught but had signed off on anyway, on the grounds that something was better than nothing and nothing was what humanity had had 6 months ago. The Valorian Commission had sent a message to Thessaly Venn. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that she read it, closed the device through which it had been transmitted, and did not speak for 11 minutes. Kezia, who had been in the room reviewing translation notes, timed it on her watch without quite meaning to. "The Commission has determined," Thessaly Venn said at last, "that the observation period for this civilization is to be concluded." She said it the way you say something that you have been practicing. "Their assessment is that your species has not yet demonstrated the institutional stability required for the next phase of contact. The decision is to withdraw to the secondary monitoring position and recommend a review in approximately 40 of your years." Kezia put down her pen. "What does that mean practically?" "It means I leave. The orbital platform is reduced to automated monitoring. Your civilization continues as it was, with the knowledge that contact occurred and waits." She paused. "It is the most common outcome of initial contact. Most species require multiple observation cycles. There is no judgment in it." "You sound," Kezia said carefully, "like you're reading from a document." Thessaly Venn looked at her. It was a long look, and it was one of those moments, they had become more frequent over the past 3 months, when Kezia had the vertiginous sense that she was being seen with a precision that she could not reciprocate. "I am," Thessaly Venn said. "I am reading from the Commission's assessment. I am doing this because if I speak in my own words, I will say things that I am not permitted to say in my official capacity. Then say them unofficially. The Commission measures institutional stability through 6 metrics. Your civilization currently fails 4 of them. I disagree with 2 of those failures. But my disagreement is not the Commission's methodology, and the Commission's methodology is not wrong." She told Kezia, slowly, precisely, and with a care that Kezia would later describe as almost painful to witness, that the Valorian Commission's assessment framework was built on a database of 214 civilizations at various stages of development. It was, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinarily well-calibrated instrument. The 6 metrics: internal conflict index, resource sustainability trajectory, institutional longevity, information democratization rate, cooperative crisis response, and something that translated approximately as narrative coherence across subgroups, had predicted developmental outcomes with approximately 87% accuracy across the known database. Humanity scored well on 2 of them: information democratization, which the Commission had apparently found remarkable given the age of the species, and what Thessaly Venn translated as an adaptive ideation rate, that was not, strictly speaking, one of the standard 6 metrics, but which had flagged as an outlier significant enough to generate a Commission subreport. "You are," she said, with something in her voice that Kezia had learned to recognize as the closest Thessaly Venn came to expressing a strong personal opinion, "more creative than the database predicted. Not artistically. Institutionally. When your existing frameworks fail, you generate new ones at an unusual rate. Most species either adapt slowly or collapse. You tend to produce novel structures in crisis. Is that good? It is unpredictable. The Commission finds unpredictability concerning. I find it." She stopped. She picked up her coffee cup, looked at it, set it down without drinking. "I find it the most interesting thing about you. The withdrawal was to happen in 30 days. Kezia spent those 30 days doing what any careful anthropologist would do," she observed. She watched Thessaly Venn move through the center's routines with the same deliberate precision as always, attend the formal sessions with the same composed neutrality, answer every question from the diplomatic team with the same measured accuracy. She watched her read. She had developed, over 11 months, a preference for nonfiction accounts of historical crises, which she read with the focused attention of someone studying case files, and she watched her sit by the north-facing windows in the early mornings and look at a sky that was not her sky. On the 22nd day, Thessaly Venn asked Kezia about the concept of home. Not about Valoria. Not about Earth. About the concept itself. What it meant to humans. Whether it was a place or a state. Whether it could be learned or only inherited. Whether, in Kezia's professional experience studying human cultures across centuries, any people had ever successfully built a home in a place they had not come from. Kezia answered carefully, knowing she was answering carefully, knowing that Thessaly Venn knew she was answering carefully and would account for that. She talked about diaspora communities, about refugees who had made meaning in foreign places, about the research suggesting that what humans called home was less a location than a network of relationships and familiar rituals. "We're quite portable actually," she said. "Historically. We'll put roots down almost anywhere if we can find a few people who know how we take our coffee." Thessaly Venn was quiet for a moment. "Then, that is in the Commission's database as well. Your attachment formation rate is unusually rapid and unusually durable. It is flagged as a vulnerability." She paused. "The Commission regards rapid attachment as destabilizing in interspecies diplomacy. Observers are advised to maintain professional distance." "And have you?" Kezia asked. "Maintain professional distance?" Thessaly Venn looked at the north-facing window. "I have maintained every behavior consistent with professional distance," she said, which was not an answer to the question asked, and they both knew it and neither of them said so. On day 26, Kezia filed a formal request with the Secretary-General's office for an emergency extension of the observation period, citing, with considerable and very deliberately chosen technical language, an unresolved classification question in the Commission's assessment methodology that warranted further expert review. She attached 43 pages of documentation, most of which was legitimate, some of which was speculative, and one page of which was, if anyone read it carefully, a fairly transparent argument that the Commission's metrics did not account for civilizations that were in the active process of changing. She did not tell Thessaly Venn she had filed it. She found out anyway. She always found out. She didn't say anything. But the next morning the coffee was already made when Kezia arrived. The Zurich incident, as it came to be called in the official record, though incident was doing considerable work as a word, began at 4:18 a.m. on a Wednesday in the 28th day before the scheduled Valorian withdrawal. A coordinated series of cyber attacks targeted the center's communications infrastructure, the secondary data relay connecting to the orbital platform, and the external server cluster hosting the publicly released sections of the First Contact Accords. The attacks were sophisticated. They were also, forensically, almost immediately traceable to a nationalist coalition operating out of 3 different countries, which suggested either remarkable incompetence or a very deliberate message. It was a message. The coalition, which called itself the Terran Sovereignty Collective and had roughly 40,000 active members across 7 countries and considerably more passive sympathizers than anyone in government had wanted to publicly acknowledge, had concluded that the First Contact Accords represented an unacceptable cession of human sovereignty to an extraterrestrial power, that the Commission's withdrawal was being improperly delayed by corrupt officials, and that the appropriate response to both problems was to make it impossible for the Center to communicate with anyone until their demands, which were poorly specified but emotionally legible, were met. The attacks were largely unsuccessful. The Center's systems went dark for approximately 4 hours, then came back online via redundant protocols that the Valorian technical team had quietly helped install in month 3. The external servers were replaced within 6 hours. The data relay to the orbital platform was restored by noon. What the collective had not anticipated was the secondary effect. During the 4-hour communication blackout, the orbital platform's automated systems had registered the signal disruption as a potential hostile event and had, per Valorian standard protocol, begun preparing the descent vehicle for emergency extraction of their observer. Thessaly Ven had been woken at 4:23 a.m. by an alert on her personal device. She had gone alone to the center's roof access point, a decision that had caused the security detail approximately 7 minutes of severe professional distress, and had transmitted a manual override to the orbital platform, canceling the extraction protocol. She had then gone back to her room, and when the center's communications came back online at 8:41 a.m., she had filed a formal incident report with the Commission in which she classified the event as a civil disturbance with no threat to observer security and recommended no escalation of response. Kezia learned about the roof. She learned about the override. She learned that Thessaly Ven had been standing in 40-degree November air in the dark, alone on a rooftop, talking her own ship out of coming to get her, for approximately 22 minutes. "You could have left," Kezia said. They were in the small room adjacent to the main briefing space, which had become, without any formal designation, the place where they had the conversations that didn't belong in formal briefings. "The platform would have extracted you. The Accords have a provision for observer safety. No one would have contested it." "Yes. But you told it not to come." "Yes." Kezia waited. This technique, patient, undemanding silence, had proven more reliable with Thessaly Ven than direct questions, which she could deflect with extraordinary elegance. 40,000 people did not want me here. The correct response to that information is not to confirm their conclusion. Thessaly Ven Karath, Private Briefing Month 12. "The collective's argument," Thessaly Ven said at last, "is that my presence here represents an imposition. That humanity has not consented to this contact. Not fully, not across all of its subgroups. This is not an incorrect observation. It is a reasonable concern." She paused. "The error is in concluding that the appropriate response is removal. You cannot resolve a question of consent by eliminating one of the parties to the conversation. Some of them just don't want you here." "Yes, I know." She said it without apparent distress, which told Kezia more than distress would have. "I have read their communications. I understand their arguments. Some of them are afraid of what I represent. Some of them are processing a genuine philosophical disruption. Humanity is no longer alone, and that fact restructures the self-concept of every individual on this planet in ways that will take generations to fully integrate. Their discomfort is legitimate." Pause. "Their methods are not." "And what about you?" Kezia asked. "Are you afraid?" Thessaly Ven looked at her. "Of the collective? Of any of it? Of this?" Kezia gestured, vaguely, inadequately, at the room, the center, the situation in its entirety. For a moment Thessaly Ven was very still. Then she said, "I am, there is not a word in the translation matrix that is exactly right. I am something in the direction of afraid of leaving. I have not encountered this particular feeling at a previous assignment." She said it clinically, but the clinical tone had the particular quality of precision deployed to manage feeling rather than describe it. "It is outside the parameters of my training." The formal aftermath of the Zurich incident consumed the next week. There were hearings in 3 countries. 4 members of the collective were arrested. The Security Council passed a resolution reaffirming the Accords. 2 member states abstained, which prompted Thessaly Ven to spend an afternoon reading the abstaining countries' histories in what Kezia could only describe as an expression of genuine curiosity uncomplicated by judgment. She was interested in the dissent, not threatened by it. The Commission, reviewing the incident, updated its assessment of humanity's cooperative crisis response metric. upward, by a margin small enough to be meaningful and large enough to notice. The withdrawal date was 11 days away when Kezia received a second classified document she was not supposed to receive. This one was shorter. It was a summary of Thessaly Ven's filed reports over the previous 12 months, annotated by a senior commission analyst whose tone Kezia could not fully parse through the translation but which read, even in the flattened language of bureaucratic assessment, as something between concerned and astonished. The annotation noted that Observer Karatha's reports had, over the 12-month period, shifted in a measurable way. Early reports used the standard commission language of distance and categorization. Later reports, particularly those filed in the last 4 months, used the first person at a frequency 4 standard deviations above average for observers at this stage. They contained more specific detail. They cited individual humans by name in contexts that went beyond diplomatic identification. They contained, the analyst noted with what Kezia could only read as institutional discomfort, an unusual number of observations about what specific humans meant by what they said, as distinct from what they said. The annotation concluded, observer demonstrates characteristics consistent with deep engagement. Recommend review of assignment suitability for extended contact protocols. Note, observer's incident reports remain technically accurate and professionally composed. The concern is not the quality of her work. The concern is the nature of her interest. Kezia read that last sentence 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called Thessaly Ven's room. "Are you awake?" she asked. "I don't sleep as much as you do," Thessaly Ven said, which wasn't an answer either, but by then Kezia had stopped needing them to be. "Here is a document in the archives of the Interspecies Diplomatic Center. A physical copy, printed on paper, filed in a manila folder with a handwritten label, that most historians of the first contact period consider the most consequential piece of paperwork produced in the 21st century. It is not the first contact accords themselves, which are longer and more formally significant and are displayed under climate-controlled glass in Geneva. It is not the Security Council resolution or the UN declaration, or any of the 17 bilateral agreements that followed. It is Thessaly Ven Karatha's formal petition to the Valorian Commission, filed on day 357 of the observation period, 8 days before the scheduled withdrawal, requesting a review of the withdrawal determination and requesting, in a secondary clause that the Commission's procedural department apparently took 3 days to process because they had no existing category for it, permission to remain on Earth in a non-observer capacity under a protocol that did not yet exist and that she was proposing be created for this purpose. She had drafted it in the early mornings, Kezia later learned, while the coffee was brewing. The petition was 11 pages. Kezia read a copy, Thessaly Ven gave her one, without explanation, on the morning she transmitted it, and found it to be the most disciplined piece of argumentation she had ever encountered. It did not appeal to emotion. It did not describe personal attachment. It did not say anything that could be read as a violation of the Commission's codes of observer conduct. What it did, with extraordinary methodological precision, was construct a case that the Commission's 6-metric assessment framework produced a systematic blind spot in evaluating civilizations that were actively in the process of institutional transition. She had compiled data from the Commission's own database. She had identified 11 civilizations in the historical record that had been assessed as below threshold and withdrawn from, which had subsequently collapsed, and 3 that had been assessed identically and had subsequently stabilized. Her analysis of the difference between the 2 groups identified a variable the Commission's framework did not formally measure: the presence of external relational accountability at the moment of maximum institutional stress. In other words, civilizations were more likely to stabilize when someone was watching who cared what happened to them. The Commission's withdrawal protocol assumes that observation and presence are separable. This analysis suggests they are not, in cases where the observed civilization has achieved sufficient awareness of being observed to alter its behavior in response. Petition of Observer Karath, filed day 357. The secondary clause, the request to remain, was framed in the same neutral methodological language. She proposed that an observer who had exceeded the standard engagement metrics and developed what she clinically termed deep situational investment could, under a new protocol she outlined in an appendix, be reclassified as an engaged correspondent rather than an observer, with different reporting requirements, different constraints, and critically, different rules around what constituted permissible involvement. She was not asking to stop being Valorian. She was not asking to become human. She was asking for a category that didn't exist yet, that would allow her to be both things in a way that had formal institutional structure rather than no structure, which was the alternative. Kezia put down the document and sat with it for a long time. Then she called her department head at the center, who called the Secretary General's office, and by afternoon the UN had assembled a working group whose title, the Joint Human-Valorian Framework Review Committee, was 6 words longer than it needed to be and contained, as its human co-chair, Dr. Kezia Marchetti-Obi, who had never chaired a working group in her life and immediately called her graduate supervisor in a mild panic. "You're asking me to help design a diplomatic category for an alien who wants to stay," her supervisor said. "Essentially. Does she want to stay because she's been ordered to or because?" "Nobody ordered her," Kezia said. "She petitioned. She filed paperwork. She cited precedent from 11 historical cases and proposed a new regulatory framework." Pause. "She did it in the mornings? Before the briefings? She used the Commission's own methodology to argue against the Commission's conclusion." Her supervisor was quiet for a moment. "That," he said, "is the most human thing I have ever heard." The Commission's review process took 6 days. 6 days during which Thessaly Venn continued her routine with complete external composure, attending briefings, reviewing translation materials, drinking her coffee, reading about historical crises. She did not bring up the petition in any formal session. When junior diplomatic staff asked whether she expected to stay, she said truthfully that she did not know and moved on. Kezia watched her and thought about all the things Thessaly Venn understood about humans that she was choosing, very deliberately, not to deploy. She could have made the situation emotionally legible to the human delegation in a dozen ways that would have generated enormous political pressure on the Commission. She had the skill. She had the knowledge. She had spent 12 months learning exactly how humans told stories to themselves and to each other, exactly which emotional registers produced action and which produced paralysis. She didn't use any of it. She filed her paperwork. She made her argument on its merits. She waited. "You could push harder," Kezia told her on day 4 of the waiting. "The media would respond. The public would respond. You know they would." "Yes. But you won't. The Commission's decision must be its own," Thessaly Venn said. "If I manipulate the outcome, I validate every concern about observer interference. And," she paused, "and if I stay because of pressure rather than because the argument was sound, then I have not actually demonstrated anything about whether staying is the right decision. I have only demonstrated that I know how to apply pressure." She looked at Kezia steadily. "I want the argument to be the thing that works. Not because I am naive about what else might work. Because if the argument is what works, it means the argument was correct." Kezia stared at her. Then she said, "You're the most stubborn person I have ever met." Thessaly Venn considered this. "Is that a human compliment?" "Sometimes." "Good," said Thessaly Venn, and she drank her coffee. The Commission's response arrived on day 6. It was 73 pages, which the translation team processed overnight. The conclusion, on page 73, in language that was formal and precise and, Kezia felt, carried somewhere within it the weight of an institution surprised by itself, was, "The petition of Observer Karath is granted in principle. The proposed protocol requires refinement. Observer Karath is authorized to remain in a provisional capacity pending development of the engaged correspondent framework. Duration, indefinite, subject to annual review." Kezia read it at 6 a.m., alone in the briefing room before the coffee had finished brewing. Then she walked down the hall to Thessaly Venn's room and knocked on the door. It opened immediately. Thessaly Venn was awake. She was always awake. "They said yes," Kezia said. Thessaly Venn looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. I'll make the coffee." The Commission's formal review hearing was held in the 14th month, 3 months after the provisional authorization, when enough of the engaged correspondent protocol had been drafted that the institutional framework could hold the weight of an actual accounting. It was conducted via the long-range communication system that the Valorian technical team had installed in month 2, a device that looked, as Kezia had once told Thessaly Venn, like someone had designed a satellite dish by describing one to a sculptor who had never seen a dish. Thessaly Venn prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically, privately, and with a completeness that Kezia found both admirable and slightly exhausting. She spent 2 days reviewing her own reports from the full 14 months. She requested, formally, that Kezia not be present for the preparation. She prepared a summary document, a supplementary analysis, and what she described simply as a personal statement. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Kezia waited in the adjacent room, which was not the same as not listening. The Commission's panel was composed of 5 senior officials whose titles translated approximately as senior assessor, Methodological Review Chair, Protocol Ethics Officer, Civilizational Development Archivist, and the one that had given the center's translation team the most difficulty, something like the Keeper of Precedent, whose role appeared to involve maintaining the institutional memory of every prior first contact case and intervening when the panel was about to make a decision that contradicted one. The hearing opened with a procedural review of Thessaly Ven's reports. The commission had found them accurate. They noted the statistical shifts in language and framing that the earlier analyst had flagged. They asked her about them directly. She confirmed them. She did not apologize for them. "You are aware," the senior assessor said through the translation matrix, "that the shift in your report language is consistent with what our protocols classify as observer entanglement." "Yes," Thessaly Ven said. "And you are aware that observer entanglement is classified as a methodological compromise." "I am aware that it has been classified that way, yes. I have a position on whether the classification is correct." Pause. "State your position." The Commission's framework was built on the assumption that useful observation requires distance. I would argue the evidence of this assignment suggests that useful observation of a species at this developmental stage requires proximity. Not distance. Proximity. Because this is a species that only reveals itself fully to those it trusts, and it does not trust easily or quickly, and the observer who maintains formal distance will, after 14 months, have seen only the performance. She went through it methodically. The 11 historical cases. The 3 that had stabilized. The variable she had identified. She had, over the 3 months since the provisional authorization, refined her analysis further, adding 4 additional cases from the archive that the Commission's Civilizational Development Archivist had apparently sent her in what Kezia later understood was an unofficial act of collegial assistance. The archivist had found the analysis interesting and had, without explicit authorization, expanded the dataset. The protocol ethics officer raised the obvious challenge, that an observer who had become invested in a civilization's outcome could not be trusted to assess that civilization accurately, because they had a stake in a particular conclusion. "Correct," Thessaly Ven said. "I cannot assess this civilization neutrally. I have a preference for its continuation. I want it to succeed." Pause. "I would argue that this preference does not compromise my observations. I would further argue that the Commission should consider whether neutral observation of a civilization in crisis is actually what the Commission wants, or whether it merely assumes that neutral observation produces the most accurate information. In my experience of this species, they tell the truth most readily to people who want them to be okay." There was a long pause on the Commission's side. The Keeper of Precedent spoke for the first time. "Observer Karath, what is your assessment of this civilization's developmental trajectory?" Thessaly Ven took a breath. "They are at a transitional moment that will resolve within approximately 20 to 40 of their years. They are aware of the transition and are actively, noisily, inefficiently, with considerable internal conflict, attempting to navigate it. They have better tools for this than the Commission's metrics currently capture. They have a capacity for institutional reinvention that I have not encountered at this level in the database, and I have reviewed the database extensively." She paused. "They are also capable of extraordinary cruelty to each other. They carry a significant amount of pain in their history and they have not fully processed it. They will not fully process it in the 20 to 40-year window. This is a risk that I believe the Commission's framework correctly identifies." "Then why stay?" the senior assessor asked. And here Kezia, listening through a wall, eyes closed, heard the quality of silence change. It was the silence of someone who had finished the prepared part of their testimony. "Because the risk of staying is that I observe a civilization that fails and I am personally affected by that failure," Thessaly Ven said. "The risk of leaving is that a civilization fails that might not have, and no one who knew it is there to testify to what it was. To what it tried to be." Her voice had not changed in register. It remained even, precise, controlled. "We are a commission of observers. Our function is to see and to testify. I am asking permission to continue observing. I am asking permission to testify to a civilization that has not yet finished being what it is becoming." Pause. "And I am aware that there are personal considerations underlying this professional argument. I'm not hiding them. I am choosing not to make them the argument, because the professional case is sufficient and the personal case is. It is not the Commission's business, and it is not a basis on which the Commission should make its decision. But I am not pretending it is not there." The hearing went into recess. It lasted 40 minutes. Kezia sat in the adjacent room and did not move. When the Commission returned, the Keeper of Precedent spoke again. They noted, for the record, that there was one case in the Commission's 214 civilization database in which an observer had petitioned to remain on assignment beyond the Commission's initial withdrawal determination and had been granted provisional authorization. One case. They noted that this case was now, for the first time, moving from provisional to formal. They noted that the engaged correspondent protocol as drafted created a new category in the Commission's institutional framework, the first new category in 140 years of Valorian records. Observer Karath, the keeper of precedent, said, "You are creating precedent." "I am aware," she said. "Precedent is, by definition, a framework that others will use after you." "Yes." "Is that your intention?" Pause. And then Thessaly Ven said something that the translation team would spend 6 months discussing because the Valorian word she used had no good equivalent. It sat somewhere between hope and design, between intending something and wanting it deeply enough to make it likely. The translation matrix settled, after considerable deliberation, on the English word yes, with a footnote 3 paragraphs long. Even years after the Tuesday in November when a ship appeared in low orbit and held position over the North Atlantic with extraordinary patience, Kezia Marchetti-Obi delivered the Whitaker Lecture at the University of Edinburgh, an annual event in the Department of Social Anthropology that typically attracted an audience of several hundred academics and a modest number of interested members of the public. That year, the lecture hall held 1,100 people and there were 2,000 watching the live stream when the feed crashed, which the university's communications office had not anticipated and spent 20 minutes apologizing for. The title of the lecture was, On the Sociology of Witness, What the Karath Case Tells Us About Human Self-Knowledge. Kezia spent most of it talking about what Thessaly Ven had taught her, not about Valoria, not about the broader interstellar community, not about the Commission's database of 214 civilizations, though all of those things were part of it. What Thessaly Ven had taught her about humans. "There is a version of the last 7 years," Kezia told the lecture hall, "that is a story about humanity being validated. About an alien species arriving, studying us and deciding we are worth staying for. I understand why that story is satisfying. I would ask you to be suspicious of it." Pause. Thessaly Ven Karath did not stay because we passed some test. She stayed because she was doing her job, and her job evolved, as all good work does, into something richer than its original description. She stayed because she had built something here that had meaning. Not because we earned it. Because she made it. The 7 years had not been smooth. No reasonable person had expected them to be. The Terran Sovereignty Collective had not disbanded after the Zurich incident. They had reorganized, moderated some of their more extreme public positions, and become a persistent feature of the political landscape in several countries, a constant pressure that required constant response and that had, Kezia was honest enough to admit, pushed human institutions to clarify their own positions in ways that were probably useful even when they were painful. The Commission had sent 2 additional observers in Year 3, working under the newly formalized engaged correspondent framework. Both were more conventionally professional than Thessaly Ven, which had caused considerable comment in the academic literature and considerable private amusement between Kezia and Thessaly Ven. The disclosure process had continued, slowly, deliberately, through the graduated tranches the Commission had designed. Humanity now knew that there were 37 spacefaring civilizations within what the Commission designated as the local cluster. It knew that 4 of them had achieved what the Commission classified as stable interstellar relationships. It knew that it was not, by any reasonable measure, the most technologically advanced of the 214 civilizations in the database, and that it was not the least, and that technological advancement was, per the Commission's long experience, almost entirely unrelated to civilizational longevity. It knew that Thessaly Ven's petition and the engaged correspondent protocol had been adopted formally into the Commission's framework and had, in the 4 years since formalization, been cited in 3 other first contact cases as precedent. The keeper of precedent had sent Thessaly Ven a formal notification of each citation. She kept them on her desk. Kezia had asked about them once. Thessaly Ven had said, without looking up from what she was reading, "Precedent accumulates." That was always the point. She did not fall in love with humanity the way a tourist falls in love with a city, enchanted by the surface, unacquainted with the plumbing. She fell in love with it the way a doctor comes to love a difficult patient, knowing the prognosis, understanding the complications, choosing engagement anyway. Kezia Marchetti-Obi Whitaker Lecture. In Year 4 there had been a global crisis, a cascading infrastructure failure across 4 continents, the details of which were still generating post-mortem analyses, which had tested every institutional framework that the previous 3 years of first contact era diplomacy had built. It had also, incidentally, been the event that had produced the most significant upward revision of humanity's cooperative crisis response metric in the Commission's records. Thessaly Venn had filed a 40-page report on it. The Commission had flagged it as an outlier. The civilizational development archivist, who had by then established an informal correspondence with Thessaly Venn that both of them described as professional and that Kezia described as a friendship spanning 4 light years, had sent a personal message that translated approximately as, "I told the panel this would happen." In year 5, Yusuf Adeyemi Okafor, the radio astronomer who had first heard the signal, who had become, somewhat to his own bewilderment, one of the public faces of the first contact era, had given a lecture of his own at Cambridge on the encoding inefficiency he had noticed in that first transmission. He had spent 5 years working on the question with Thessaly Venn and with Valorian technical specialists, and his conclusion, published simultaneously in 3 journals and translated into 23 languages before the week was out, was that the redundant encoding scheme was not, in fact, inefficient. It was maximally safe. It was designed to be readable by a civilization at any level of signal processing capability, from the most sophisticated to the most rudimentary. The 30% bandwidth wasted on error correction ensured that even a damaged signal, received through interference, would arrive interpretable. They weren't writing to someone they weren't sure could read, Yusuf said in the Cambridge lecture hall. They were writing to make absolutely certain that whoever was reading could not misunderstand. He paused. That's not inefficiency. That is the most careful thing I have ever seen. Thessaly Venn, sitting in the 3rd row, she attended most public lectures now, a habit she had developed in year 2 that the center's communications office had learned to quietly arrange, said nothing. But Kezia, sitting beside her, saw something move briefly across her face and then be composed away, and she knew what it was because she had learned, over 7 years, to read that face with something approaching accuracy. It was the expression of someone who had hoped to be understood and had been. At the end of the Whitaker lecture, a graduate student in the back of the hall asked Kezia a question that had, in various forms, been following the first contact story for 7 years. Why did she stay? Not the institutional answer, the petition, the protocol, the precedent. The real answer. Why did Thessaly Venn Karath, who had a home and a civilization and a commission that would have recalled her without consequence, choose to remain on a small, complicated, historically violent planet orbiting an ordinary star? Kezia thought about it for a moment. Then she said, I think she stayed for the same reason anyone stays anywhere. Because she had built a life here. Because the people she had come to know were here. Because she was, in a way that was professionally complicated and personally unambiguous, home. Pause. And because she believed, and I think she still believes, that what happens here matters. Not just to us. To the record. To every civilization that comes after us in the database, and every observer the Commission sends to some other small, complicated planet, who will open the archive and find the Karath case and know that staying is possible. That it has been done. That someone made it work. She stopped. She didn't choose us over her own world. She found a way to make this one part of her world. And she is constitutionally incapable of doing that casually. So she is still here. After the lecture, walking back through the Edinburgh streets in the November dark, it was always November in these stories, Kezia thought. It had been November when the ship appeared, and November had never felt the same since. She called Thessaly Venn, who answered on the 2nd ring. How was it? Thessaly Venn asked. Good. Someone asked why you stayed. What did you say? The truth. Pause. Is the coffee on? A moment. Then, it's been on since 6. Kezia smiled into the cold air. I'll be back in 2 hours. And she was. And the coffee was ready. And the north-facing windows were lit against the dark. And some distances, it turned out, were not as large as they first appeared, not when someone had chosen, with full knowledge of the alternative, to stand on the same side of them as you. That, in the end, was what the Commission's database had not been designed to measure. Not whether a civilization was stable, but whether it was the kind of place someone, given the choice, would choose to stay. It was, Thessaly Venn had once observed, the most reliable metric of all.